Welcome to the solution video for the Soda Machine Continuous Integration Challenge. Let's go over to our Azure DevOps and we're going to set up our continuous integration. So to do that, we're going to go to Pipelines. Inside Pipelines, we'll create our pipeline. Don't forget we already have our code in the repository, so that makes life a little easier. You don't have to have your code in Azure DevOps in order to use a pipeline. You can use it independently, which we'll see, but it just kind of makes it a little closer together, I guess is all you could say. So create pipeline, and we're going to use the classic editor. I find that teaching the YAML version is harder, and I will teach that, and I'll probably create a video soon about that because it's important to know, but it's kind of a step back, I think, from the classic editor and how it works. So we're going to use the classic editor down here, and we'll choose Azure DevOps, and the master branch is fine, repository is correct, so we're all good with the defaults there. And we're going to choose the .NET Desktop as our template. A template is just a starting point. You can do multiple things in your build, and in fact you could do Python build plus .NET build if you wanted to. There's not a reason to in most cases, but you could do it. It's just use one of these as your starter template. We're going to use the .NET Desktop since that most closely applies what we're doing. And now we've got our build set up. So what we're going to do is I'm going to rename this to be our CI build for continuous integration. And then I am going to save and queue it right away. Not going to do anything to it. We're just going to see if right out of the box this works. So what it's going to do is restore our NuGet packages, build a solution, run our tests, and then copy out to a zip file. So let's just see if this runs. We're going to hit save and run and see what happens. So this could be a really short video. I know it's not going to be a really short video, but it could be because we're just using the basic standard stuff. And that standard stuff's all kind of configured right, but there's a few tweaks we have to make. And I did want to show you the failing build first, because that's the most common thing you're going to see is a failing build. If you look at my repositories, I'm setting things up, you'll see, failed, and finally a success. And so the dashboard on the overview page, I sometimes set that up to show me what percentage my builds are passing or something like that. And when I first get set up, it's an ugly percentage. I mean, I've had as low as like 11%, 10% of my builds are passing because you gotta try and fail. And it feels like you should learn this and you should know this and it should just work once you understand it. But there's always little tweaks to every project that are just a little bit different. There'll be a few of them here that we'll see. And the first one right away, NuGet restore, it says, and let's zoom in here a little bit. It says the NuGet command failed the exit code of 1, which means failure. And the error is, if we scroll over here, the current .NET SDK does not support targeting .NET Core 3.1. Either target .NET Core 2.2 or lower, or use a version of the .NET SDK that supports .NET Core 3.1. So the .NET SDK does not support 3.0 or 3.1 that we're using, which is problematic. So let's find out why that is. Let's go over to our edit pipeline. And if we look, the agent specification is Visual Studio 2017 in a Windows 2016 box. That seems kind of old. Let's go with Visual Studio 2019. Now, before I queue this, I'm going to make another change, and that is right here where it says use NuGet 4.4.1. That's an old version. In fact, it's also an old version of the task. If we look, the task is a newer version, which changes some things. And the NuGet version to install, if you click this, it's going to give you a list of NuGet versions. And if we look, there's a preview and a preview, but then there's this 5.4.0, which is called released and blessed. That means that this is good to use in production or anything. I don't want to say I know that, but I do know it doesn't work, or it does work. So 5.4.0, and we always will check for the new versions. If you check this box, it's always going to update that NuGet version just in time. It's not going to change this value, but it is going to update that NuGet package. So, or NuGet exe file. Okay, so that's going to update NuGet. So between that and changing our agent specification, I think that will fix this build issue. I believe it's one more issue. We're going to find out. Now note, since I'm running this manually, I can specify the agent manually, but I want to make sure my default is correct. So save and run. And we'll see how this job does. We'll watch it, and then it should get beyond the NuGet step. All right, so it started the checkout process, and it's download NuGet 5.4.0, which is good. It's doing the restore now, and it looks like it's not going to fail on us. We'll find out for sure, but it looks like it's getting good. I'm going to pause the video in here a couple times. I want to show you how this works, but at the same time, I don't want to bore you with let's watch paint dry now. So I'm going to pause the video. All right, so the NuGet restore did work, and the build worked. If we look at VS test, we did get a warning. Let's zoom in on this warning here. Warning, no test sources found matching the given filter. So it's not finding any test sources to run our tests against, which means that while it didn't fail, it didn't run. And this is something to look out for, because if you go back here and you look at this job, it has the green check mark. If you go to pipelines, it's got the green check mark for success. So it's saying, hey, I succeeded. But really, it didn't succeed, even though it has a green check mark, because success, yes, but it has no test sources found. So you see the little dash here for tests. So we can zoom in a little bit. There's a dash here for tests, which means there's no test being run. That's not ideal, because we do have unit testing in place. We want that to run, and we want to fail the build if the tests don't pass. Now, if it doesn't find any tests, then it really can't fail the build. Let's go down here to test assembly. And what it's looking for is in the release directory. So in release, it's looking for star test star.dll. So let's go back to our pipeline, open this up, and we'll go to artifact. And I don't know that bin release. So it does have in release our exes. And notice this is the tests folder. So in here, there's going to be a sodomachine library.tests.dll. So it does appear the test DLL is here. But let's go back and edit this again. And let's make a tweak here to our tests. So instead of star test star, we know that our tests are plural, and that before tests is a dot. Now you could just navigate directly to that DLL and just call it good. But I don't think that's ideal, because then if you add another project with unit testing in it, that won't get run. Okay? Now, in build configuration, I do want to specify there may be a directory underneath that. So star star indicates this directory or one of the subdirectories or a subdirectory of a subdirectory. Like that's what that indicates. I think that path will get us what we want. We're going to find out. All right. It is a little different for .NET Core than it is for .NET Framework. So that's one of those things where you're tweaking things on a build because your project's a little bit different than you've been doing. If you're used to .NET Framework projects and go to .NET Core, there's a couple of tweaks. All right, so we got a completed build now. Notice the VS test has 21 seconds. That's more indicative of actual tests being run. So if we look down here, I'll zoom in a little bit so you can be a little bigger. I can't shrink that down. Excellent. If I zoom in a little more, there we go. Cool. So if we scroll down here and look, a total of one test file matched the pattern. That's good. We only have one test file. And then it started and finished. And if we look at, here's all the tests that ran. Notice the length of time they run, the little check marks next to them. We scroll down the bottom. The test run was successful. We had 19 tests and 19 passed. Total time was 12 seconds. Now don't get overly concerned with the time here because this is on a shared resource server that we're running this. The bigger deal here is to just kind of keep an eye on how your tests are doing. So maybe you have all passing tests, but maybe they start taking a lot more time. So if you put a change in the code, you don't change any tests, you just change the code, and it all passes, and you upload it, and now the test takes a minute to run instead of 12 seconds, that's something to investigate. But your tests are more than just about yes or no, they worked or they didn't. They also have built in some, not much, but some performance monitoring capabilities. So you can look at that and go, okay, generally I get a feel for how a change did. May things a little faster, may a little smaller or slower. So just something to keep an eye on. So this worked, and we get our green check mark, cool. And if you look now under tests, it says 100% passed. Also notice there's a test tab up here. Click on that. Really cool little graphic. Shows how many passed out of how many. The duration that it ran. Also notice this red arrow, and the red indicates this is longer than it was the last time it ran. Well, of course, because the last time it ran, it didn't run any tests. So this gives us, it says, aborted +1 actually is a filter. It says failed or aborted. That's why it says +1. It's not saying there's an aborted test. It's saying it's 2 items in this drop down, not just 1. So this would show you any failing tests, and if it did, it would show you where they failed or what the error message was. Okay, so this, we now have testing in place. Now, there's still a warning here. It says the variable EX is declared but never used. If you click on that, all right, So let's go back to tasks now. Let's look at VS test. We scroll down here to the bottom and we look, and we can go under control options and just make sure this continue on error is unchecked. So if a test fails, it will stop the build. And that's what we want. We want it to fail the build and say, no, you have to have working tests in order for you to push to production. Now that may seem harsh because you may say, well, but I got this weird funky test that always fails until you tweak it. Well, you need to fix that, because you can't just guess and say, well, we think that the tests, even though they failed, it's probably the test that just fails all the time. So therefore, let's go ahead and pass the build. Because then what's the point of running tests at all? Make sure that your tests pass. Fix the test if you have to, but make sure they always pass. Okay? So make sure that box is unchecked. That's going to fail the build if it's unchecked, which is good. Okay? So now you can hit save. And now this is all saved. And there are some other things in here. Run in parallel on multi-core machines, run tests in isolation, code coverage, we could enable that. And so it would give code coverage information about the test. That's kind of cool sometimes. Don't get too caught up in code coverage. Some people really want to have 95%, or some people insist on 100% code coverage, which is just silly. And the reason it's silly is because you're then testing things that you shouldn't test. Okay, you're testing that datetime.now gives you the value of datetime.now. Like some things you shouldn't test because they're not yours to worry about. So you write your code. Don't get too caught up in the percentage of coverage of your tests. Okay? So that's really all there is. So you go back to pipelines. You can see that we have a CI build. What I would do traditionally is I would have just one build, and I'd have multiple releases. One for production, one for staging, one for test, one for development. But all off that one build. And it's just based upon the branch, which one you build for, or which one you deploy. But we'll get to that. So that's it for this lesson. When we come back for our next weekly challenge, we're going to start building some Razor pages. So look out for that. Okay? But anyways, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.